few minutes late. Sorry about that. So our topic today is cyber risk quantification. So there are many schools of thought for cyber risk. At Metric Stream, we have been more focusing on qualitative risk assessment. We have been doing that for many, many years. It has been adopted in compliance risk, operational risk. For ESG, for cyber, and for op risk, we also felt the necessity that we should actually come up with a quantification engine. So today, what we'll do in partnership with C-Risk, we will actually present to you the journey from, I would say, from qualitative to the quantitative, but it's a journey, right? It's not one versus the other, right? It is a question of how you mature your organization and realize the value of why you need to do quantification, if at all. Now, it's a very upcoming topic, if you will, and I don't want to steal the thunder, but quick. And I come from banking industry. I spent 25 plus years at Citi. We have been supporting market risk, credit risk, operational risk, audit, compliance, HR, many functions. Sufyan, my colleague, is here from Citi. He knows me. So the fact being that in 1990s, people would never measure market risk. They would always talk about market risk, but they didn't know how to measure it. Then came a time VAR model became very popular. And today, nobody can think market risk without factor sensitivities and VAR, right? Same thing happened with credit risk. Operational risk, which is very close to what cyber risk is, was very subjective for a long time. Maybe it is still subjective. But over the period of years, around early 2000, 2004, 2005, that's where the regulators start saying, well, what is your risk-weighted asset? What is your capital requirement? You have to set a certain percentage of your capital to manage your risk. Came a lot of pressure on the organization. Okay, let's start defining. And you cannot do this high, medium, low. There has to be a way to define how much of my capital has to be reserved to manage the operational risk, right? We believe strongly that we are at that juncture where regulators are going to come back and ask for setting aside some amount of a capital to manage cyber risk and, in future, ESG risk. So it's a natural progression where one starts saying, well, how much of your capital should be reserved for it? I think the organization will start realizing that we will probably take this more seriously in terms of measuring the risk. But IT risk in general, where I think cyber risk is a subset of IT risk in general is a very vast topic. Today, some organizations, IT risk does not fold into the chief risk officer, especially in the banks. They have their separate reporting lines. We believe that is also going to merge, and it will be one of the primary stripe of risk. With that, I would like to introduce my buddy here from C-Risk, Tom. And Tom has been practicing cyber risk modeling quantification, and he has a company called C-Risk. And I'd like to hand it over to Tom to take it further.
Thank you very much.
I will do a little bit of interruptions from time to time, but over to you, Tom.
I'll ask Joy some hard questions later on. I'm sure he's paying attention. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to come here towards the end of the day. I know you've got a choice of the different tracks. Just a quick introduction. So my name is Tom Callahan. I'm one of the founders of C-Risk. We've been on that journey towards quantification for a number of years now, about 5 years, which is a long time in quantifying cyber risk. And we kind of, just a quick kind of explanation of C-Risk, I won't spend too long on this, but we do training around cyber risk quantification, which is really important before you embark on a CRQ journey. We kind of help customers with some consulting, and we do what we call enablement services. And we're a partner of Metric Streams, where we can kind of enable customers who want to use Metric Streams' CRQ module. Now, I have another role in the FAIR Institute. So the FAIR Institute is a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting and kind of helping members quantify cyber risk or measure cyber risk. So if you're interested in quantification and best practice, I would encourage you to check out the FAIR Institute. And some of the kind of methodologies I'll talk about today kind of use the FAIR standard. It's not the only way to do CRQ. And of course, we can kind of, take components from that standard, add to it. But again, I would encourage everybody to think about CRQ in terms of open standards. Okay? So just to kind of quick through the agenda, There's been a lot of talk of CRQ, cyber risk quantification, over the past few days. I'm going to explain what it is, because there's no kind of single definition. We're going to talk about the use cases and the adoption and what's driving adoption, not only from actual use cases, but kind of outside pressures, external stakeholders. We'll talk about how you actually do CRQ, what tools do you need, and not only software tools, but kind of approaches, methodologies, definitions. We'll show some examples of what the output looks like, and then talk about building up a capability. Again, it's a journey. Okay. So what is cyber risk quantification? There isn't any standard definition. The FAIR Institute has a definition for risk. Gartner have kind of come up with, I guess, more and more refined definitions for CRQ. And on this slide, we have 3 definitions. We have the Gartner definition, which is a method of expressing risk exposure from digital environments to an organization in business relevant terms. And that's super important. The most business relevant terms is typically financial terms, but it doesn't have to be, right? We can translate financial back into other ways of kind of expressing risk. The ISACA definition, which is inspired kind of by the FAIR standard, it's the ability to quantify and express the impact and frequency of risk in financial terms. And that's very much a financial terms definition. And the third definition is a definition that MetricStream use, which I like. It's the use of quantification techniques, models, and frameworks to calculate the exposure to risk in monetary terms. So we're going to focus on monetary terms in terms of CRQ, but CRQ can be used to express risk in other terms as well. Okay, so that's what CRQ is. It's equally important to think about what it's not. There's a lot of misunderstanding about CRQ. And even risk itself is a term which is not clearly defined. And we have lots of vendors, particularly in the cyberspace, talking about managing risk. So cyber risk quantification is not a replacement for existing risk management standards. It's a kind of an add-on. It complements it. It can improve your accuracy. It can improve the way you communicate risk to other stakeholders. Because we are dealing in numbers, people get a false impression of precision. Therefore, some stakeholders think you're predicting the future, which is not the case. It's still risk. It's still uncertain. CRQ is not a single absolute measure of risk. Again, because we're working in monetary terms, and we talk about risk in terms of financial terms, some stakeholders kind of they have a mental model that we're giving you an absolute value of risk, which of course is not possible. Risk is uncertain by nature. And CRQ is not, even though we're talking about and modeling the impact of things like vulnerabilities and threats on a risk scenario, CRQ is not measuring those things. We're measuring risk in financial terms. And I guess finally, CRQ is not kind of using ordinal scales to replace qualitative labels. So we're not assigning numbers to high, medium, low. And that's again, super important. Okay. So we know what CRQ is, we know what it's not, like what are the use cases? So on the slide, we kind of have on the left-hand side, we've got Gartner's view. So Gartner's position on CRQ is kind of interesting to track over the kind of past few years. They were pretty skeptical a few years ago. They've done a number of surveys, talking, their analysts talking to clients. The conclusion is that CRQ is kind of on that tip on the hype cycle. It's starting to become something which is adopted and useful in organizations. The main use case today is communication. Communication of cyber risk to internal and external stakeholders. This is a Gartner's opinion again, based on their kind of, their interviews. The second use case is more about kind of prioritizing. I think we got some examples earlier on from Gavin with Meta, prioritizing how you deal with risk. And you can also align cyber risk to other risks in the organization, which is super important. Now in C-Risk, we've been kind of doing this for 5 years. So our view is broadly similar. Communication is probably the biggest and most important use case, but not the only one. Helping the CISO size and justify their budget is important. And it's kind of sizing is that important aspect, right? Because we have clients that reduce their budget, having done CRQ activity, because they're over-investing, because things they perceive as risk aren't actually that risky after all, and they're holding the business back. The other thing which we found is regulatory compliance, and Joy, you can spoke about this, right? Mm-hmm. So there's kind of two ways of looking at this. You can really help develop a better relationship with your regulators by showing them the fact you're doing CRQ. So that's kind of an optional extra. But we're seeing in the kind of regulatory universe, I think it's coming, an obligation to quantify cyber risk. And that's really interesting, and how it's going to pan out, how it's going to happen, what techniques, is there going to be a standard approach? And these are things which are kind of, forming in the industry. But I do believe that an open standard will be very important to kind of help that be useful. Another thing is understanding third-party risk. Again, third-party risk is complicated. It's a big beast, and it's kind of hard to really prioritize, one third party's risk exposure over another. And again, financially is, again, a way of communicating that exposure to other business partners. Cyber insurance seems like an obvious one. It kind of depends on the size of your organization, your policy. But what we find is that in smaller organizations, it kind of helps you to right-size your insurance coverage, specifically what's covered in your policy and what you're paying for it. And doing that kind of analysis of what's in a policy versus what your actual risks are, that can be quite surprising. And you can imagine that a lot of people think, okay, this must be great for the policy, the vendors themselves. It's probably better for the people who are buying cyber insurance. You get better insights into what's really covered and what's not. M&A, that's a great one. We've done a lot of M&A work where we're looking at both pre and post-acquisition, particularly prioritizing actions post-acquisition. Once you acquire a company, you need to look at what the assets are, how those assets are protected, particularly around things like intellectual property, or exposure to things like PII data, PHI data, internet-facing assets. So again, it's a great way to de-risk M&A, particularly post-acquisition. Pre-acquisition is kind of hard because it's hard to get the data sometimes. And then finally, it's just optimizing your overall risk reduction strategy. So these are the actual use cases we find. I think, listening to different kind of presentations today, I saw some other links to things we've seen. One around the kind of metaverse. We recently helped a customer basically sell some of their products combined with an NFT offering. That was really scary for them. They basically saw NFTs, crypto equals huge risk, but there was a huge business opportunity. By kind of going through that CRQ process and identifying the real risk scenarios associated with NFTs, the conclusion was it's another e-commerce business, and it was a great kind of way of getting confidence with the CEO to go ahead with that project, which has been super profitable. So these are the kind of use cases where you can kind of improve your communication between the CISO team and more of the business team. And I'll come back to kind of some of the other benefits of CRQ. It's not just the use cases themselves. So I spoke about kind of the evolution of CRQ and regulatory pressures. What's interesting is that risk quantification itself, is being promoted by most of the standards organizations, professional organizations, and it's coming into some kind of legislative compliance obligations within different geographies and industries. So we have NIST, ISO, ISACA, they all promote CRQ. Some promote CRQ using FAIR, others don't make a recommendation on the particular methodology you should use. Professional organizations such as COSO, the Institute of Directors, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, they have all recommended the use of CRQ within decision making to help implement controls. And finally, and probably most interesting for this group, is that in certain geographies, we have basically obligations to perform CRQ on cyber risk and declare it in the annual report. And that's the case in Germany with the IDW 340. And the SEC is really hovering around risk right now. There's going to be some announcements coming out. And I don't know if CRQ will be obligatory, but I think it's going in that direction. I don't think, Joy, in that kind of whole compliance space?
Yeah, so basically what we seeing that some, again, not to refer to only FAIR as the methodology, but there are obviously other ways of measuring it. But I think the risk measurement is the key, because unless you really measure it, you can't really make or take any actions around it. And buying an insurance, for example, how much insurance should you buy, right? How much of risk you should probably expose your organization to, and how do you make the decision if you cannot even quantify? So I think it's becoming very relevant that, well, how much enough is the insurance amount should be, and whether should be looking at it every year to see, well, how do you go back in the period of time and do a back testing of your model and see whether even you bought so much of insurance that it really, do you really need to reduce your premium? Does it make sense? So I think the way it's going is like, the CISOs and the CROs are actually coming together and saying, questioning what is the mitigation plan and how effective is the mitigation plan.
Yeah. And certainly what we see is that performing quantification of cyber risk scenarios brings the business teams together. So in order to examine what we call the loss flow, you need to talk to general counsel, you need to talk to the CISO, needs to talk to the CRO, which doesn't always happen. You need to talk to the marketing team. What are they doing with personal data? It really brings that executive team together, and it gives us something to focus on, which is not a controls-based approach, but more of kind of a financial-based approach. And again, I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So everybody's kind of wondering, how do I do this? Most people think it's really hard. Maybe it's too much investment. I haven't got the skills. Well, it's actually not that difficult. There are a few kind of key principles and tenets. And I did stress at the start that I would suggest taking an approach using an open standard. FAIR is currently the only open standard. And the principles in FAIR are kind of things which have developed over the past 20 years. A lot of it's come from kind of VAR type techniques, which Joy mentioned. There's a lot of academic research behind the methodology that is promoted within FAIR. So again, I would recommend checking that out. But basically what you need, right, is that in order to measure risk, you first of all need a clearly articulated risk scenario. That sounds like something very basic, but it's a foundation. And if you talk to different stakeholders in cyber today, you'll find that people don't have the same mental image for different words. Risk is often equated with vulnerabilities, with threats, with operating models. None of these things are risk, right? I think Gavin mentioned it. For risk, you have to have an asset, which is clearly defined. There needs to be a threat agent or actor or something that would harm the asset, and there has to be an impact. And if you don't have that clearly articulated, you can't measure it. So even by driving that rigor into your risk assessment methodology, you get an immediate win. The second thing you need is a way of modeling the relationship in a risk scenario between those different things. And also measuring those relationships using numbers. Not ordinal scales, but actual numbers that you can do mathematics on later on, so we can get a statistical output. Which, it kind of looks similar to the existing approaches, but there's a kind of a very important slight difference which gives you that ability to measure things. And I'll show you the ontology, the FAIR ontology, which is that relationship between the different factors in the model. And it's pretty flexible what you can do with the ontology, but the most important thing is you can measure every variable in the model. I mentioned the idea of using measurement, using real units of measurement rather than ordinal or verbal scales. So we think about things like percentage, control strength, as opposed to high, medium, low. Impact is always in financial terms, as opposed to high, medium, low. And probability is normally thought about in terms of times per period. And again, that's super important that it's things we can measure. Once we can measure them, we can calibrate data. People feel that they're uncertain about data. There are things called calibration techniques that you can improve the quality of data, even if it's uncertain. And you can work with statistical tools where instead of having one single value, you think about data in terms of ranges. So if you're unsure about a piece of data, it's not a good idea to go with what I call false precision. You go with, I believe the value is somewhere between min, max, with a most likely. And you can also think about the distribution. Am I closer to the min or the max? You need data. Another objection to CRQ is that I don't have enough data. It's not really true. In any organization, you have enough data in the business to think about the impact of an event. You need to talk to the right people. There's lots of data about cyber events. Some of it's aggregated from external providers, and you don't have to buy it. It's not available for free. But you can also get internal data from your SOC teams, your security teams. You can get security telemetry in some of your controls. But you don't even need to do that, right? You can start with the basics, which is what's the impact and you can estimate the probability of an event based on the company size, their industry, and geography. And that's relatively easy to do kind of once you know how. And finally, you need to present the output. Now, this is really important. You know, CRQ is often presented as a kind of an annualized loss exposure number, which can be quite confusing, but sometimes it's zero. Because if something only happens once every 10 years, the most likely impact is zero in a given year. So that doesn't really kind of work very well as a presentation tool. But there are many different statistical functions you can pick out of a loss distribution to present the output to the stakeholders in a decision. And that's a kind of a long, complicated sentence. But what I'm saying is that you need to understand why are you doing an analysis, who you're presenting it to, what decision will they make, and then you can pick how to present that risk scenario, again, in financial terms. Okay? So that's a lot of kind of information there that kind of sink in. We'll send out the deck later on.
Yep.
So let's just kind of, so I guess in summary of how to do it, you define your risk scenario, make sure it's measurable. You pick data points for the different factors contributing to the probability of occurrence. And that can be things like control performance, external threats, and then the impact. The impact is split into different types of financial loss, some of which will happen immediately, some of which will kind of happen over time. And you put those into a statistical engine where you're measuring the range of probable values for each variable. That's your Monte Carlo engine. And that gives you a distribution of your future probable loss. Okay? Now, this is the FAIR model. I'm not going to go through this, obviously, in detail. But you really just need to kind of use you can start with what I call loss event frequency for the majority of scenarios. The most important thing is to focus on impact. What's the financial impact of a particular scenario that's well scoped and well defined? Once you get that done, it's amazing what you can achieve in an organization. You can refine loss event frequency over time as you get more data about controls, about threats, and here's something about the asset in the sense of what subcomponents make up an asset. Because an asset's not a server. An asset's like a business service that's built with technical components underneath it. Quick plug for MetricStream. So MetricStream have this in.
So the way we looked at MetricStream, the quantification engine, by the way, this same quantification engine is being applied for ESG and for op risk, right? Out of the box as a service. It's operating on SageMaker AWS Cloud. It can be ported to any cloud solution. The idea here is, you know, we do two things here. One is to simulate at the node level and come up with a range of numbers, 10,000 simulation, 100,000 simulation, how much you want to do it, right, based on your capacity. And then the next thing is you have to do an aggregation and ranking. Now, as you know, we're using Monte Carlo simulation as a basic, so Monte Carlo by default it's not additive. So you cannot compute two nodes and just add it up and come up with a higher node number, right? So the way it has been modeled within MetricStream is all of these features, we call it as features, right? It's loosely coupled, it can be defined. You can define the hierarchy at which level you want to do the computation, how many simulations you want to do, what kind of statistical functions you want to use to do the simulations, what is the mean, max, median, which you can capture at every node, right? And the probability distribution can vary from node to node. So that's how it has been modeled, and it's horizontally scalable because of the fact that you can actually run it on the cloud, right? Now with that, I think Tom will show you that how FAIR can easily be fit into that.
So, I mean, you know, I'm trying to help you visualize what this looks like at the end, right? So this is just kind of a few screenshots of the MetricStream module. You can see this is similar to the FAIR model I put on the screen. And really, what you need here is try to get the right data points to do your analysis. But what pops out at the end, right? So you have a collection of statistics around different forms of loss, what the distribution, what those losses are, and how they can unfold over time, which is really interesting. So you know we can see here we have an example of a confidentiality scenario, which is more about kind of data breaches of maybe PI data and what kind of impact that might have in terms of legal fees or compliance fees or kind of, loss in confidence of your customer base. An availability scenario is different, again, depending on the asset. And the way we kind of present the output is that we can think of annualized loss, where you're comparing different scenarios with different probabilities. But we can also look at modeling what's the kind of range of most likely financial impact for a scenario, and also the range of probabilities. And we can think about, the average of those, which is useful in some situations. And then we can compare different risk scenarios by using the most likely loss per scenario, or else the ALE. And these are just examples of charts that you can build using different reporting tools, again, which are based on the output from the analysis work. Make sense? Okay, so how do you build out this capability? It's definitely a journey. It's something which you can do relatively quickly and with relative ease. It's possible, in our experience, to do kind of a top 3 risk analysis at a macro level within kind of 10 weeks without having a huge drain in your organization, working with a kind of a stakeholder group of 4 or 5 people. That's what I would recommend doing to start with, just to get a feel for how it works, get comfort that you can access the data in your organization, and get comfort in what you can do with the output. I think there was a question earlier on about, if you had the financial risk of an organization, what would you do with that number? Well, again, we break it down into scenarios with particular assets. We think about what decisions are being made within the organization regarding those services or assets or controls. We have lots of examples of helping customers communicate better with regulators by showing them the amount of due diligence and analysis behind the scenes. So it's important to select useful and achievable use cases. Very important to take a macro approach. I think lots of cyber engineers will see the model. They go, this is fantastic. Wow, I want to go down to the lowest level of the model and put my data in. That's not a good idea. You always take a top-down approach and then refine it later on by layering in more data about controls if it's available. You should always complement what you have already. This shouldn't replace your existing, risk governance process. It can help to improve the quality of things like risk registers. It can help to, move you towards a more kind of less subjectivity in the way you do things. But again, it's a journey and it complements what you're doing already. Again, you focus on the use cases where you need quantification rather than saying, I'm going to quantify everything. You need to invest in education and training. This is a new approach. It does require some new skills. Always focus on the financial impact, what we call the right-hand side of the model first. The probability of occurrence can be, again, refined over time. Don't worry about the data. You have the data in your organization. We've been doing this for 5 years now. We've now had a situation where we haven't been able to find the data. At the start, you probably need to get some help to kind of train your team. But once you get up and running, you can become self-sufficient. And it's very important not to fall into the trap of trying to be precise or the illusion of precision because you have numbers. Again, you're trying to move on a journey from kind of subjective to more objective. It's okay to have wide ranges at the start, narrow those down as you get more data and you learn more about your environment. And you don't need to be super mature to do this, right? It doesn't really matter where you start, right? Just as long as you start somewhere. I think you heard that already today. And it's good to be transparent and open. There are some solutions in the marketplace which are like black boxes. They'll kind of pop out a number and tell you that's your risk exposure. That's very dangerous. If you go to a CFO or a C-level meeting and give them a black box number and you can't explain where it comes from, you're probably going to fail. And finally, I would iterate and refine over time. I've gone through that really quickly, right, because we don't have a lot of time. But
yeah, so in the interest of time, Tom, is it okay to, if there's any question from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope we have not put you into sleep.
There must be a question somewhere in there.
There's one question, yeah. Come in. And Joy, just to let you know, you need it in the other track in a minute.
So other risks quantifications like market risk and credit risk and operational risk, is there any big difference? Or also, do you also have like testing or validation process for the quantifications?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I'm not an expert in market risk. so I probably can't answer it maybe as well as I should. But what I'll tell you is that, yeah.
But I am the expert, I can tell you. But go ahead.
So
we have implemented market
we're
research
going to
series,
team up on this, right? I'll give you my perspective and Joy can give you his. So, yeah, you can absolutely test the models. Obviously, the first year you do this in an organization, it's the first time you're doing it. As you do it over time, you can refine and test the models. You can also compare it to past events in that organization or in that industry. Yeah, so that's what I think that Joy.
So basically, in the market risk, if you look at the products and you see what are the factor sensitivities, and you're actually doing a simulation on the factor sensitivities, the ranges of that, right? If you do a parallel here, here the product is equal to your asset, right? The factor sensitivities, which is really well defined for derivatives, you can actually say what are the factor sensitivities. Mostly, in cyber today, that's a challenge because what are the key features or factors we want to say which will be applicable to that particular asset. For example, the asset is on the cloud, right? What are the finite list? That is actually growing at this point. I would say that there's no standardization around it. So once that comes in, right, I think it will be more like market risk, if you will. Obviously, credit risk is you're doing a measurement of the chances of default, but that's also a similar kind of observation. But I think this is very close to how your market risk is being computed today. But that's how you can do a parallel between the two, right? But here, the number of factors can be huge, and the scenarios can be infinite, right? Where it becomes extremely difficult how do you narrow it down. Yeah. So I don't think there is a maturity enough in the market today to come up with some kind of standards. But it's an excellent question, and that's exactly what we started thinking when we did it, and when we were creating this whole full flexible model, if you will, in metric stream. We could not hard-code the number of factors. We could not hard-code the relationship because that doesn't exist. Yeah. So in market risk, you define the correlations, for example, between the market factors, right? Here, the correlation between the factors, asset in the cloud, what are the kind of threats you have, right? What are the factors you want to really consider? How they're correlated with the other factors? There's not enough data in the market today. But so that will grow over the period of time.
I would say that it's back to this idea of iterating the models. You can start with kind of a broad brush view, and as Joy said, you can expand the model to include different factors. There's a lot of work being done to think about, MITRE attack kill chains, how they map to different control frameworks, whether it's like CSF or CS8, and that can be mapped further down into the FAIR model to the different factors. And there's an extension of this model called FAIR CAM, which is called a control analytics model, which is very new, and again, will take time to refine, but it's designed to try to address that question. But, you can get a useful level of accuracy in your analysis without needing to model all the factors. And again, a lot of people who try this for the first time try to think about all the factors, right? Yes. I want to model everything, and if I don't model everything, it's going to be wrong. That's you can just work top down, and you can get a perfectly, useful result for the decision at hand. Better so than the existing kind of subjective methods.
And interestingly enough, our human brains are trained to actually quantify. We are less trained in doing qualification, rather quantification. So when we say high, medium, low, we actually think of ranges, how high it is and how. So we don't say that, but when you start saying, you start asking that questions to the risk officer or IT CISO, right? Inherently, they will say, there is a probability of happening this over the period of time. More probably, this is the amount of loss I'm going to incur. But there's always that in the mind. But you often don't put down on the paper. So I think that this actually helps in the conversation to build this model in a more of a conversational way rather than actually doing it in a piece of paper.
Great. So just to finish up,
yes, please.
Again, thank you for listening to us. If you're curious, want to learn more about this, reach out to me on LinkedIn. We can absolutely have a conversation, point you to some more resources, in particular the FAIR Institute, and how you can do this. There are some kind of learning tools available free of charge, which you can use on the internet or share that with your teams, I guess. And I would encourage people not to be afraid to kind of take the journey here. It's one step at a time, but you can get results really quickly.
Yep, great. And I would say that if you are starting to think about cyber risk, please also start thinking about quantification because it's not late, but one thing is for sure, for a business, you really need to identify what are the critical business processes you are trying to protect from the organization point of view. And you start with the top down. To Tom's point, you can narrow down the number of scenarios. You can really get to a point where you can effectively manage risk and secure the funding. That's more important, right? So thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Tom.